They say the dead don't speak. But that night, standing before the crumbling stone monument in the forgotten corner of the graveyard, I heard them screaming. Not with voices, you understand. Nothing so simple or merciful as that. No, the dead speak in silence, in the weight of absence, in the cold that seeps into your bones and whispers that something precious was stolen from this world before its time. They speak in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when you realize that justice was never served and truth was never told. My name is Ilara, just Ilara. No family name worth remembering, no lineage worth speaking of, no ancestors who did anything remarkable enough to be carved into history. I was born in the village of Thornwick with calloused hands and a bent back before I'd even seen my 20th year. The kind of woman that nobles look through like window glass. The kind whose entire existence can be summarized in 3 words: she cleaned floors. I scrubbed those floors in Shadowmere Castle when I was 12 years old, my knees raw and bleeding through my thin dress. I washed linens that cost more than my family's annual income. Sheets so fine they felt like clouds between my fingers. I served wine to people who wouldn't remember my face if I stood before them for 100 years. To them, I was furniture, a broom with legs, a convenient set of hands to carry things they couldn't be bothered to carry themselves. That was my life. Simple, predictable, invisible. And I'd made my peace with it, mostly. You learn to accept your place in the world when every alternative seems impossible. You learn to find small joys in the warmth of fresh bread on a cold morning, in quiet evenings by a fire that actually works, in the absence of active cruelty. You learn to stop dreaming about anything more because dreaming only makes the reality hurt worse. My mother used to tell me that we were like stones in a river. We didn't control the current. We just existed where the water put us, worn smooth by forces too large to resist. She died when I was 14, coughing blood into rags we couldn't afford to replace. My father followed her 6 months later, broken by grief and labor and a lifetime of bending his back for people who never learned his name. They're buried in the paupers section of the Thornwick graveyard, marked with wooden crosses that have probably rotted away by now. But that night, 7 years after I'd last visited their graves, I wasn't there for them. I'd gone to the graveyard because that's where I went when the world became too heavy to carry alone. There's something honest about graveyards, you see. They don't pretend. They don't put on airs. They simply exist as monuments to the truth that all of us, noble and peasant alike, end up in the same cold earth. The grave I visited most often was set apart from the others, in the oldest corner of the cemetery, where the stones leaned at drunken angles and moss covered everything like a funeral shroud. It was surrounded by rose bushes that should have been dead, should have been cleared away, but they never died completely. They just existed in this strange state between life and death, their black petals never quite falling, their thorns still sharp enough to draw blood if you got too close. The name on the gravestone had been scratched away long ago, deep gouges in the marble, as if someone had taken a blade to it in fury or grief or both. But everyone in Thornwick knew whose it was supposed to be. We all remembered the night 7 years ago when the bells tolled until dawn, when Lord Malachi Shadowmere stood in the castle courtyard and howled like an animal in pain, when the entire kingdom went into mourning for a child they'd never met, Lysander Shadowmere, 4 years old, only son of the most powerful vampire lord in the kingdom, dead in a fire that consumed the east wing of the castle. No body recovered. Nothing left but ash and grief and questions no one dared to ask too loudly. To the nobility, he was just another tragedy to whisper about over evening tea. To the peasants, he was proof that even the powerful couldn't escape death. To me, he was something different. He was a mystery I couldn't solve, a question that kept me awake at night, staring at ceiling beams and wondering why nothing about his death made sense, because I'd been there that night, working late in the noble quarters, refilling oil lamps and turning down beds for people who would never thank me. I'd been 3 corridors away when the fire started. I'd heard the screams, smelled the smoke, seen the chaos as guards ran toward the flames and nobles ran away from them, and I'd seen something else, something that had haunted me for 7 years. I'd seen 3 figures leaving through a servant's entrance while everyone else was running toward the fire. One of them had been carrying something wrapped in a blanket, something child-sized, and one of them had been Lord Cassius Ravencroft, the king's closest advisor, a man who stood to gain everything if House Shadowmere fell into chaos. I'd wanted to scream, to raise the alarm, to do something, but fear had frozen my tongue and common sense had kept it frozen. What would happen to a peasant girl who accused a noble lord of kidnapping? What evidence did I have besides my own eyes in the darkness? Who would believe me? Who would even listen? So I'd stayed silent, carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest for 7 years. Watched a father grieve for a son who might still be alive. Watched a kingdom mourn a boy who might have been stolen rather than killed. And I'd hated myself for it every single day. That's why I came to this grave. To confess to someone who couldn't judge me. To tell the truth to stones and roses that couldn't betray my secrets. To ask forgiveness from a child who might not even be dead. But that night was different. That night, I had something more than guilt and suspicions. I had proof. 3 nights earlier, I'd been walking through Thornwick's Market Square after finishing my shift at the castle. It was twilight, that strange hour when the world exists between day and night, when shadows grow long and reality feels thin. The market was mostly empty, just a few merchants packing up their wares and children playing their last games before being called home for supper. One of those children caught my eye. A boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with dark curls that caught the dying sunlight like ravens' wings. He was playing with a toy, making it swoop and dive through the air like a bird in flight. And that toy, that impossible toy, made my heart stop. It was a wooden raven, carved with exquisite skill, each feather detailed with a precision that spoke of countless hours of work. Its wings were spread as if frozen mid-flight, and its eyes were twin rubies that caught even the faintest light and threw it back like drops of blood. I knew that raven. I'd seen it before. 7 years ago, I'd been cleaning the floors outside the young lord's nursery when Malachi had presented it to his son on his 4th birthday. I'd paused in my scrubbing, watching through the half-open door as the vampire lord had knelt before his child with such tender care it had made my chest ache. He'd placed the raven in those tiny hands and whispered something I couldn't hear. The boy's face had lit up like sunrise. He'd clutched the raven to his chest and announced, in that serious way young children have, that he would name it Corvus. 3 months later, that child was declared dead. Killed in a fire, they said. There wasn't even a body to bury, just an empty grave and a father's howls echoing through the night. But here was Corvus. Here was the raven that should have burned with its owner. Here was proof that someone had lied, that something terrible had happened that night, something worse than accidental death. I'd approached the boy slowly, careful not to frighten him, asked him where he'd gotten such a beautiful toy. His face had changed instantly, the childish joy replaced by something ancient and afraid. Before I could say another word, a woman had appeared from the crowd. She'd grabbed the boy's hand, yanked him away from me, and disappeared into the throng of people so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined the whole encounter. But I hadn't imagined the woman's face. I'd seen the desperate terror in her eyes, the protective fury, the look of someone who would kill to keep a secret safe. And I'd recognized something else too. That boy's eyes. Those ancient, haunted eyes in a child's face. Eyes that had seen things no child should see. Eyes that belonged to someone who'd been stolen from their life and forced to become someone else. I'd followed them. I know it was reckless, I know it was dangerous, but I'd carried guilt for 7 years and I was so tired of it weighing me down. I'd kept myself at a distance, using every skill I'd learned growing up poor and invisible. Nobles never notice servants, and crowds never see the unremarkable. I'd tracked them through the market, down narrow alleys, toward the edge of town where civilization gave way to the wild darkness of Thornwick Woods. The woman had looked back once, her hand tight on the boy's shoulder. She'd scanned the street with the practiced paranoia of someone who'd been hunted. I'd pressed myself against a wall, barely breathing, until she'd apparently decided it was safe and hurried into the trees. I'd wanted to follow further, but the woods had always frightened me. Local stories said they were cursed, that people who went too deep never came out. That old magic lived in those trees, the kind that didn't care about mortal concerns. So I'd watched them disappear into the shadows and memorized exactly where they'd entered. Marked the spot in my mind with the precision of someone who knew they'd need to find it again. Then I'd turned and run back to town, my heart hammering, my mind racing, my entire world tilting on its axis. Lysander Shadowmere was alive. I was almost certain of it. And if he was alive, then someone had taken him. Someone had let his father grieve for 7 years. Someone had committed a crime so monstrous it made my stomach turn. But what could I do? I was nobody. A peasant with no proof beyond a toy and a suspicion. If I went to the castle guards, they'd laugh me out the door. If I went to the nobles, they'd have me thrown in prison for spreading lies about the dead. And if I went to Lord Malachi himself, if I dared approach one of the most powerful vampires in existence with a story about his supposedly dead son, he'd either ignore me or kill me for the insult. So I'd done the only thing I could do. I'd gone to the grave and sat in the cold autumn night, clutching the wooden raven I'd found abandoned in the market square after the woman and boy had fled. I'd pressed my forehead against the cold gravestone and whispered to whoever might be listening. I told them I was sorry. Sorry for being silent 7 years ago. Sorry for being too afraid to speak up when it might have mattered. Sorry for all the cowardice and fear that came with being powerless in a world run by people who could crush me without a second thought. But I also made a promise. I swore that I would find the truth. I swore that I would bring justice to whatever darkness had stolen that child away, even if no one believed me, even if I had to do it alone, even if it cost me everything. I swore it on the graves of my parents, on the honor of every powerless person who'd ever been silenced by fear, on the memory of a child who'd once laughed in his father's arms and named a wooden raven Corvus. That's when the temperature plummeted. It wasn't gradual. One moment, the autumn evening was merely cool. The next, my breath turned to ice crystals in the air, and frost began creeping across the gravestone beneath my hands. The wind, which had been rustling through the dead roses, died completely. Even the usual sounds of the night, the crickets and the distant owls and the soft rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, went silent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever was happening. But my body wouldn't move. It was as if fear itself had frozen me in place, turning me into just another monument in this garden of the dead. Then I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. The sound of someone who wasn't in a hurry because nothing in this world could threaten them. The sound of a predator approaching prey that had nowhere to run. I should have been terrified. I should have screamed or fled or at least turned to face whatever was coming. But something kept me frozen. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was simply that I'd already decided I was willing to die for the truth. And here was death coming to collect. I turned slowly, so slowly. Each movement felt like it took an hour, and when I finally saw what stood behind me, my mind simply refused to process it at first. Because the being before me wasn't a man, even though he wore a man's shape. He stood 10 feet away, impossibly still. Not the stillness of someone who's stopped moving, but the absolute absence of movement that comes from something that doesn't breathe, doesn't blink, doesn't do any of the 1,000 tiny unconscious things that make living creatures seem alive. He was like a statue carved from midnight itself, or perhaps he was midnight, given form and consciousness and terrible, ancient purpose. His clothes were dark and elegant, cut in a style from a century-long past. Formal, expensive. The kind of outfit you'd wear to a funeral or a coronation or perhaps both. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making him appear as a void against the background of tombstones and dead roses. His face was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful. Dangerous, ancient, eternal. Sharp cheekbones and a jaw that could have been sculpted by a master artist. Pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, like moonlight on snow, hair black as a raven's wing, falling to his shoulders in perfect waves that moved despite the absence of wind. But it was his eyes that paralyzed me. They were the color of blood in moonlight, red so deep it was almost black, with pupils that seemed to go on forever, like looking into an abyss that looked back. They held centuries of sorrow, rage, and something else I couldn't name. Something that made me want to weep and scream and fall to my knees all at once. Those eyes were fixed on the wooden raven clutched in my trembling hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was like velvet dragged across broken glass, beautiful and terrible, hypnotic and horrifying. The kind of voice that could command armies or seduce kingdoms or simply make you forget your own name if he wished it. He told me his name, and even though I'd known who he must be the moment I saw him, hearing him say it made it real in a way that seeing him hadn't. Malachi Shadowmere, Lord of the Night, Keeper of the ancient bloodlines, Master of Shadowmere Castle and all the territories that fell under its shadow. One of the original vampires, old enough to remember when the kingdom was just a collection of warring tribes and the current royal family was still learning how to farm. He was the father of the boy in the grave, the boy who'd been taken 7 years ago, the boy whose toy I was currently holding like a talisman against the darkness. And he asked me, in that voice that shook something deep in my soul, where I had gotten his son's raven. I could have lied. God knows I should have. When a vampire lord who's mourned his son for 7 years appears in a graveyard at midnight and asks you a question that could change everything, the smart thing, the safe thing, the sensible thing to do is tell him whatever will let you walk away alive. But I'd never been very smart, or safe, or sensible. So instead of lying, instead of saying I'd found it abandoned in the market or bought it from a traveling merchant or any of 100 other falsehoods that might have protected me, I told him the truth, every word of it, every terrible, dangerous, impossible word. I explained about walking through the market 3 nights ago, about seeing a child with dark curls and eyes too old for his face, about recognizing the raven and knowing with absolute certainty that I was looking at something impossible. I told him about the woman who'd grabbed the child and fled, about following them to the edge of Thornwick Woods, about marking the spot where they disappeared into the trees. As I spoke, I watched his face, watched emotions cross it like storm clouds racing across the sky. Disbelief at first, his eyes narrowing as if trying to determine if this was some cruel joke or elaborate trap. Then confusion, his perfect features twisting as he tried to reconcile what I was saying with what he believed to be true. Then hope. Such painful, desperate hope that it was almost rage, burning in those blood-red eyes like a fire that had been banked for 7 years and was suddenly given air to breathe again. When I finished, silence fell between us. It stretched on for what felt like hours. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for him to either dismiss me as insane or tear me apart for daring to give him hope about something that couldn't possibly be true. Instead, he asked me a question I hadn't expected. He asked me why. Why would I care about some supposedly dead noble's child? Why would a peasant girl involve herself in the affairs of vampires and nobility? What did I possibly hope to gain from this? Did I want money? A position in his household? Protection from some enemy? I looked him in those blood-red eyes and told him another truth, a harder truth. A truth I'd been carrying even longer than the knowledge of his son's disappearance. I explained that 7 years ago, I'd been working in his castle the night his son vanished. I'd been in the noble quarters, refilling oil lamps and turning down beds for people who barely registered my existence. I'd been there when the fire started. I'd heard the screams, smelled the smoke, seen the chaos as everyone ran in different directions, some toward the flames to fight them, others away from them to save themselves. And I'd seen something else, something I'd been too afraid to speak about until now. I'd seen 3 figures leaving the castle through a servant's entrance while everyone else was focused on the fire. One of them had been carrying a bundle wrapped in blankets, a bundle roughly the size of a small child. One of them had been Lord Cassius Ravencroft, the king's closest advisor and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. The vampire lord's face went perfectly still, not the stillness of someone controlling their emotions, but the absolute frozen immobility of a predator who's just spotted prey and is calculating the perfect moment to strike. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was colder now, harder, sharp enough to cut. He asked me why I'd never told anyone, why I'd kept this information secret for 7 years while he'd grieved and raged and slowly descended into the kind of darkness that comes from losing your only child. Why I'd let him believe his son was dead, let him stand over this empty grave and howl at the moon and curse the gods and slowly lose pieces of himself until he barely recognized the monster he'd become. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just bitter recognition of how naive he was being. I reminded him what I was, not gently, not politely. I reminded him that I was a peasant, a nobody, a woman who cleaned floors and washed linens and existed in the spaces between the lives of people who mattered. I asked him who would have believed me, who would have even listened, if I'd spoken up 7 years ago, if I'd dared to accuse Lord Ravencroft of kidnapping a noble child. What would have happened to me? I'd have disappeared. That's what would have happened. I'd have been found floating in the river with my throat cut, or I'd have simply vanished one night, never to be seen again, just another servant who knew too much and met an unfortunate end. Or perhaps they'd have been more creative. Perhaps I'd have been arrested for theft or witchcraft or any of 100 other crimes they could have fabricated. Perhaps I'd have been tried and executed in public, made an example of what happens to peasants who dare to speak against their betters. So I'd stayed silent. I'd carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest for 7 years. I'd watched a father grieve for a son who might still be alive. I'd watched a kingdom mourn a tragedy that might have been a crime. I'd watched injustice win simply because I was too powerless to fight it, and I'd hated myself for it, every single day. Every time I walked past the castle and remembered that night. Every time I saw Lord Malachi's banner flying above the towers and wondered if his son was still alive somewhere, wondering if his father would ever come for him. Every time I woke from nightmares where I saw that child-sized bundle being carried into the darkness and did nothing to stop it. I'd hated myself for being weak, for being afraid, for being sensible and smart and choosing my own survival over a child I barely knew. And I knew that was what anyone would have done in my position. I knew that self-preservation isn't a sin, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your heart are two very different things. So when I saw that boy in the market square, holding that raven, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't live with that guilt for another 7 years. Even if speaking up got me killed, even if no one believed me, even if I was wrong and the child was someone else and I was just a fool chasing ghosts, I had to try. I had to do something, because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. When I finished speaking, the vampire lord was silent for a long moment. Then he moved. So fast I didn't see it happen. 1 second he was 10 feet away. The next, his hand was wrapped around my throat, not squeezing. Not yet. Just holding me in place with the kind of casual strength that reminded me exactly what he was, and exactly how easy it would be for him to end my life. He told me he could kill me, should kill me. I'd kept his secret for 7 years. I'd let him suffer, let him believe his only child was dead and burned to ash, let him transform from a father into a grieving shell who barely remembered what joy felt like. He could snap my neck right here, drop my body in this forgotten corner of the graveyard. No one would ever know. No one would even care. Just another peasant who met an unfortunate end. I didn't try to fight, didn't beg, didn't make excuses. I just looked at him and told him he was right. I deserved whatever he chose to do. I'd earned his rage through my cowardice. If he wanted to kill me, I wouldn't resist. I'd welcome it, honestly. At least then the guilt would end. But I asked him one thing first. I begged him, with whatever time I had left, to let me show him where the child had gone. Let me lead him to the place in the woods where that woman had disappeared with the boy. Let me help him find the truth before he took his vengeance. Because if there was even the smallest chance that his son was alive, didn't he owe it to that child to look? Didn't he owe it to 7 years of grief to make sure it wasn't all for nothing? His hand tightened on my throat. Just for a moment. Just enough to make breathing difficult. I thought this was it. This was the end. I'd done what I could. Maybe it would be enough. Maybe he'd search those woods even after I was dead. Maybe my death would at least serve some purpose. Then his hand fell away. I gasped for air, stumbling back against the gravestone. He stepped away, putting distance between us. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost gentle, though that word felt wrong when applied to a being like him. He told me that for 7 years, no one had dared speak his son's name. The entire court had moved on, forgotten, treated Lysander's death like ancient history. His fellow nobles had offered their condolences and then expected him to simply continue as if nothing had changed. The servants whispered about him behind closed doors, calling him broken, unstable, too consumed by grief to rule effectively. Even his oldest allies had begun to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the depths of his mourning. But here I was, a peasant girl with nothing to gain and everything to lose, offering to lead him into danger to find a child I barely knew. Confessing to cowardice and guilt and years of silence, but offering to make amends even if it meant my death. Holding his son's toy like a sacred relic and asking only for a chance to help set things right. He asked me why I would do this. Really, truly. What did I hope to gain? I told him the truth one more time, the hardest truth, the one that made me want to weep even as I said it out loud. I explained that I'd seen his son's face that night 7 years ago, just for a moment, through a gap in the blankets as they'd carried him past. I'd seen pure terror, a child's eyes wide with fear, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to help him, and I'd done nothing. I'd been too afraid, too weak, too concerned with my own survival to help a terrified child being carried into the darkness by men who meant him harm. I'd lived with that image every day since, every time I closed my eyes, every time I tried to sleep, every time I allowed myself a moment of happiness or peace. That child's face would appear in my mind, accusing me, asking me why I'd abandoned him when he needed help most. If his son was alive, if there was even the smallest chance I could help reunite them, then maybe I could finally sleep without seeing those frightened eyes. Maybe I could finally look at myself in a mirror without hating what I saw. Maybe I could finally be the person I should have been 7 years ago instead of the coward I'd become. The vampire lord was silent for a long time after that. He studied my face with those ancient eyes, as if trying to read my very soul. Then he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He told me his name again, not as a threat this time, not as a title or a display of power, as an introduction, as if we were equals meeting for the first time. He was Malachi, and if I truly meant to help him, if I was truly willing to risk everything for the truth, then he would need to trust me. Trust, he explained, was not something he gave easily. Not after 7 years of betrayal, conspiracy, and loss. Not after discovering that people he'd considered allies had likely been working against him all along. Not after realizing that his son's death might have been orchestrated by someone he'd sat across from at council meetings and considered a friend. But he could sense something in me. Perhaps it was genuine guilt eating me alive from the inside out. Perhaps it was the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. Perhaps it was simply that I was too foolish to properly fear death, and sometimes foolishness looked identical to bravery. Whatever it was, he would let me lead him to where I'd seen the child disappear. He would let me try to make amends for 7 years of silence, and if I was lying, if this was some elaborate trap or scheme or delusion, he would make absolutely certain my death was memorable enough to serve as a warning to anyone else who might think to play games with his grief. I agreed. What else could I do? I'd already committed, already spoken truths that could get me killed, already placed myself in the hands of one of the most dangerous beings in the kingdom. There was no going back now. There was only forward, into the woods, into the darkness, into whatever waited at the end of this path I'd chosen. So I began walking, back through the graveyard, past my parents' forgotten graves, past all the monuments to people who'd lived and died and been forgotten, toward the edge of town where civilization ended and wilderness began, toward Thornwick Woods and whatever secrets they held, and the vampire lord followed, silent as shadow, patient as death, inevitable as sunrise, my protector and my executioner, walking one pace behind me through the darkness toward a truth we both desperately needed and desperately feared. The Thornwick Woods had always frightened me. Even in daylight, they seemed darker than they should be, as if the trees themselves absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. The branches grew close together, tangling overhead like skeletal fingers interlaced in prayer or warning. The ground was uneven, full of hidden roots and unexpected hollows that could turn an ankle or swallow a foot. And there was something about the air itself that felt wrong, thick, oppressive, like trying to breathe underwater. Local stories said the woods were cursed, that they'd been ancient even before the first humans arrived in this region. That old magic lived in the trees, the kind of power that existed before civilization tried to tame the world. People who went too deep never came out. The stories warned. They were lost to the darkness, claimed by whatever dwelt in those shadows. Their bones would be found years later, if they were found at all, gnawed by creatures that shouldn't exist and arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence behind their deaths. I'd always dismissed those stories as superstition, the kind of tales parents tell children to keep them from wandering off. But now, walking through the woods at midnight with a vampire lord at my back, I understood why people believed them. Because there was something in these trees. Something that watched, something that waited, something that had existed here long before any of us were born, and would continue existing long after we were dust. Malachi moved through the darkness like smoke given form, completely silent, leaving no trace of his passage. Not a broken twig, not a disturbed leaf. Nothing to indicate a being weighing easily 200 pounds was walking through dense undergrowth. He was simply there. One moment ahead of me, the next beside me, then behind me again. Always present, always watching. Never quite where I expected him to be. On the other hand, sounded like a herd of drunken cattle crashing through a market square. Every root tried to trip me. Every branch grabbed at my clothes. Every thorn bush seemed determined to draw blood. My human eyes could barely make out the path I'd marked 3 nights ago. I had to rely mostly on memory and the faint moonlight that occasionally broke through the canopy overhead. We walked for what felt like hours. The forest grew stranger the deeper we went. The trees started to look wrong. Their bark was too smooth in some places, too rough in others. Their branches bent at angles that shouldn't be structurally possible. And occasionally, I'd see faces in the wood grain. Not imagined faces. Not the kind of pareidolia where your brain creates patterns from random marks. These were actual faces, frozen in wood, eyes that seemed to follow our movement, mouths open in eternal silent screams. The temperature fluctuated wildly. One moment, I was sweating despite the autumn night. The next, frost was forming on the trees around us and my breath came out in clouds thick enough to obscure my vision. The sounds changed, too. Sometimes I heard whispers in languages that hurt my ears. Sometimes I heard music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Sometimes I heard nothing at all, and that silence was somehow worse than the noise. Malachi noticed my growing fear. He moved closer, close enough that I could feel the unnatural cold that radiated from his body, like an inverse furnace. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. He explained that these woods were older than the kingdom itself. They'd been here before humans built their villages, before vampires emerged from the ancient darkness to walk in mortal forms. Magic lived in these trees, not the structured, controlled magic of court wizards and academic scholars. This was wild magic, primal magic, the kind that existed before anyone thought to give it rules or names or boundaries. He told me that 7 years ago, when his son vanished, he'd searched everywhere. He'd torn apart his castle stone by stone, looking for secret passages and hidden rooms. He'd interrogated his entire household, from the highest noble to the lowest servant. He'd sent searchers through every corner of his territory, offering rewards for any information. He'd hunted through forests and caves and abandoned ruins. He'd used every vampire sense he possessed, every supernatural ability he'd accumulated over centuries of existence, to try to find even the faintest trace of his child. But he'd never thought to look here. These woods were protected by wards so old and powerful that even his enhanced senses couldn't penetrate them. They'd been woven into the very fabric of the forest generations ago by magic users whose names had been forgotten before his grandsire was born. The wards didn't prevent entry. That would be too obvious. Instead, they made you forget why you'd come, made you lose interest, made you decide that maybe you'd search somewhere else. They turned away attention like water flowing around a stone. But I was human. The wards had been designed to repel supernatural creatures. They barely registered my presence. I could walk through them like they didn't exist. That was why he'd let me live. That was why he needed me. I could go where he could not, see what he could not see, find what he'd been searching for 7 years without success. We pressed on. My legs ached, my lungs burned. Scratches covered my arms and face. My dress was torn in a dozen places, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because ahead, finally, through the oppressive darkness of the trees, I saw light. It was firelight, warm and yellow, and utterly mundane in a way that seemed impossible in this place of wild magic and ancient darkness. It flickered through the trees ahead, growing stronger as we approached, and with it came sounds. Human sounds. Children laughing. Adults talking. The everyday noise of people living their lives without fear or awareness of the supernatural forces surrounding them. We reached the edge of the clearing and I stopped so suddenly that Malachi nearly walked into me. Because spread before us was a village, a small settlement of maybe 20 buildings clustered around a central square. The structures were simple but well-maintained, wooden walls chinked with clay, thatched roofs that looked recently repaired, glass windows that caught the firelight and threw it back in cheerful reflections. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of cooking food. Vegetable gardens surrounded the houses, still green despite the autumn cold. Chickens scratched in the dirt. A cow lowed in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked playfully. It looked like any of 100 tiny farming communities scattered throughout the kingdom, except it shouldn't exist. This deep in the cursed woods. This far from any known settlement, protected by wards that should have made it impossible to find. It was like discovering a paradise inside a nightmare, a pocket of normalcy in a place that denied normalcy's right to exist. Malachi froze beside me. I felt him tense like a predator spotting prey. His eyes swept across the village, taking in every detail with the kind of intensity that suggested he was cataloging weaknesses and counting potential threats. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He commanded me to wait, to let him assess the situation before we moved, but I'd come too far to wait now. I'd risked too much. I'd confessed too many truths. I'd led a vampire lord through cursed woods to find a child who might not even exist. I wasn't stopping at the final moment out of caution or common sense, so I ignored his command and stepped forward, out of the trees, into the clearing, into the light. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The laughter stopped. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Doors slammed shut so fast it sounded like thunder. Windows went dark as candles were hastily extinguished. Within seconds, the cheerful village had transformed into a ghost town. Silent, dark, empty of visible life. Except for one house. At the center of the village, a cottage slightly larger than the others still had light burning in its windows. And standing in the doorway, backlit by that warm glow, was a woman I recognized immediately. She was younger than I'd thought when I'd seen her in the market square, maybe 30 at most. Her face was kind but worn, like someone who'd carried too many burdens for too long and had forgotten what rest felt like. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a practical braid. Her clothes were simple. the kind a peasant would wear. Sturdy fabric made to last, nothing decorative or frivolous. Her hands, I noticed, were rough from work, calloused, strong, the hands of someone who'd spent years doing manual labor. She could have been my sister. In another life, in another world, we might have worked side by side in the castle kitchens or washed linens together by the river. We were the same type of woman, unremarkable, invisible, the kind the world used and discarded without a second thought. But there was steel in her spine as she stood in that doorway. Courage, desperation, the look of someone who would fight to her last breath to protect something precious. Her eyes swept the clearing, searching. When they landed on me, I saw recognition flash across her face. Then fear, profound, bone-deep terror that made her face go pale. She called out to me. Her voice shook but remained loud enough to carry across the clearing. She asked if I was alone, if I'd brought anyone with me, if I'd told anyone about this place. There was such desperate hope in that question, such fear, such awareness that everything she'd built, everything she'd protected, could be destroyed in an instant if I gave the wrong answer. I lied, told her yes, told her I was alone, because I needed to know the truth before Malachi revealed himself. Needed to understand what was happening here before everything exploded into violence or chaos or whatever came next. The woman's shoulders sagged with relief. Not complete relief. She was still tense, still afraid, but some of the terror left her face. She beckoned me closer with one hand while reaching behind her with the other. A child stepped into view beside her, the same child from the market square, dark curls catching the firelight. Those ancient, haunted eyes studying me with an intelligence that seemed wrong in such a young face. He looked maybe 11 years old now, but those eyes had seen things that would break most adults, had witnessed horrors that would give nightmares for lifetimes. The woman placed a protective hand on his shoulder. The gesture was automatic, instinctive, the kind of thing a parent does without thinking when their child is threatened. She pulled him slightly behind her, positioning her body between him and me, ready to die, protecting him if necessary. I approached slowly, non-threatening, hands visible and empty, except for the wooden raven still clutched in my right hand. As I got closer, the woman's eyes locked onto that raven. She sucked in a sharp breath, went even paler, if possible. She whispered a question, asked me where I got that. Her voice was barely audible, shaking with so many emotions I couldn't begin to sort them all out. Fear, guilt, grief, resignation. The tone of someone who'd always known this moment would come eventually, but had hoped desperately it wouldn't. I told her the truth, explained that I'd found it in the market square after she and the boy had fled, that I'd recognized it, that I knew what it meant. The woman closed her eyes. A single tear ran down her cheek. When she opened them again, she looked ancient despite her youth, exhausted, defeated, like a soldier who'd been fighting for years and had just realized the battle was lost. She asked me why I'd followed them, what I wanted, what I planned to do with this information. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Her hand tightened on the child's shoulder so hard he winced. I looked at the child, really looked at him for the first time. Studied his face with the kind of attention I'd learned from years of being invisible and noticing details others missed. And I saw it, in the shape of his cheekbones, in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself with unconscious nobility despite his simple clothes and frightened expression, in those eyes that held too much knowledge and too much pain. I saw Malachi, not the ancient vampire lord. Not the supernatural predator who'd held my throat in his hand an hour ago, but the father, the man who'd knelt before his 4-year-old son and gifted him a wooden raven, the man who'd spent 7 years grieving and searching and slowly dying inside from loss that should never have happened. I asked the child his name. He hesitated, looked up at the woman for permission. She nodded slowly, tears now streaming freely down her face. Knowing this was the end but unable to stop it, unable to protect him anymore from the truth he deserved to know. The boy told me his name was Kieran. That was what she'd called him for 7 years. the only name he remembered, the only identity he knew. But before that, before the night of fire and terror and men with cruel hands who'd stolen him from his bed, he'd been someone else. He'd been Lysander Shadowmere, son of Lord Malachi, heir to one of the most powerful vampire bloodlines in existence, a child who was supposed to be dead, a boy the entire kingdom had mourned, a tragedy that had broken his father's heart and changed the course of history. He was alive, he was here, and he was standing right in front of me. The woman's voice cracked when she spoke again. She told me her name was Margaret. Just Margaret, like me. Just Ilara. Two nobodies who'd become entangled in the affairs of people far above our station. She'd been a nursemaid in Shadowmere Castle. She'd raised Lysander from birth, changed his diapers, sung him lullabies, held him when he had nightmares, watched him take his first steps, heard his first words. She'd loved him as if he were her own son, because she had no children of her own, would never have children of her own. She'd dedicated her entire life to caring for the children of the wealthy and powerful, and Lysander had been the last, the one who'd captured her heart so completely that the thought of losing him had been unbearable. So when Lord Cassius Ravencroft had come to her that terrible night, when the flames were consuming the East Wing and chaos reigned through the castle corridors, she'd made a choice. He'd told her the fire was no accident, that it was meant to kill the child, that there were forces at play far beyond what a simple nursemaid could understand. Political machinations, ancient grudges, power struggles between vampire houses that had been building for centuries. He'd offered her a deal. Save the child by helping him spirit Lysander away to safety, or stay and watch the boy die in the flames that were already licking at the nursery door. The choice had been impossible, wrong no matter which path she chose. But she'd been a mother in all the ways that mattered, and mothers don't let their children burn. So she'd taken Lysander, wrapped him in blankets to hide his face and muffle his cries, followed Lord Ravencroft and his men through the servant passages, carried the terrified child into the night while his father screamed in the courtyard, believing his son was dying. Ravencroft had brought them here, to this hidden village protected by ancient wards. He'd explained that it was a sanctuary, a place where people who needed to disappear could live in safety, political refugees, witnesses to crimes too dangerous to speak of, those fleeing persecution or death. The village existed outside the normal world, outside the reach of law or lord or even the kingdom itself. He'd told her it was temporary, that he needed time to root out the conspiracy against House Shadowmere, that revealing Lysander was alive before it was safe would only put the child in more danger. He'd promised he would return for them, that he would bring proof of who'd orchestrated the attack, that he would reunite father and son once justice was secured. But months had passed, then years, and Lord Ravencroft had never returned, never sent word, never came to collect the child he'd saved, or the nursemaid who'd sacrificed everything to protect him. Margaret had realized eventually that she'd been used, that Ravencroft had never intended to bring Lysander home. The child wasn't being protected. He was being held hostage, a living piece on a political chessboard, leverage against his father, a way to keep the most powerful vampire lord in the kingdom wounded and distracted and unable to consolidate power. She'd tried to leave. Once, about 3 years ago, had gathered supplies and taken Lysander's hand and attempted to walk out of the village, through the woods, back to civilization where she could find someone to help, someone to take the child home where he belonged. But the wards hadn't let them pass. The magic that kept the village hidden also kept its inhabitants trapped. She could enter, anyone could enter, if they knew the way, but leaving required permission, required keys of power she didn't possess, required magic she couldn't wield. So she'd stayed, had raised Lysander as Kieran, had tried to give him as normal a childhood as possible in this impossible situation, had loved him and protected him, and watched him grow from a traumatized 4-year-old into a young boy who barely remembered his father's face. who thought his nightmares of castles and vampires and a man with blood-red eyes were just dreams, who'd adapted to this small village life with the resilience of children who have no other choice. She'd known it couldn't last forever, had known that eventually someone would find them, that the truth would come out, that her choices, made in panic and fear and desperate love, would have consequences she couldn't escape. But she'd hoped, God, how she'd hoped, that maybe they could just exist here, that maybe Lord Malachi would never know his son lived, that maybe Lysander could just be Kieran forever, safe, ordinary, alive. That hope was over now. I'd destroyed it by following them, by not being able to let the mystery rest, by choosing to ease my own guilt instead of leaving them in their hidden peace. Margaret looked at me with such profound sorrow that I almost wished Malachi had killed me in the graveyard, almost wished I'd kept my mouth shut, almost wished I'd never seen the raven in the market square. Because she was right. I'd doomed them both with my need for absolution. But before I could apologize, before I could try to explain or justify or make any of it right, the temperature plummeted again, that same bone-deep cold that had announced Malachi's presence in the graveyard. The candles in Margaret's cottage flickered and nearly died. Frost began creeping across the ground, spreading from the tree line toward us like searching fingers. The boy, Kieran, Lysander, whoever he was now, went perfectly still. His ancient eyes widened with recognition that shouldn't be possible, with memory that should have faded after 7 years, with something that looked like hope and terror fighting for dominance in his young face. Margaret grabbed him, pulled him behind her, positioned herself between the boy and the darkness at the edge of the clearing. She whispered a single word, a curse, a prayer, a recognition of defeat. Malachi. The vampire lord stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight, and I watched a father see his son for the first time in 7 years. I don't have words adequate to describe what crossed Malachi's face in that moment. It was too vast, too complex, too raw. Joy and rage and grief and hope and love and fury all crashing together in an expression that transcended anything human language could capture. His perfect stillness shattered. His predator's grace abandoned him. He moved forward 3 steps and then stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. His voice, when he finally spoke, was broken, shattered into pieces that didn't quite fit together anymore. He said his son's name, just that, just Lysander, but it contained everything. 7 years of mourning, 7 years of rage, 7 years of a father's love that had never died even when he'd believed the child had. The boy, hearing that name, hearing it spoken in a voice he'd forgotten but somewhere deep in his bones still recognized, started to shake. His hands clenched at his sides. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and his eyes, those ancient haunted eyes, began to fill with tears. Margaret held him tighter, whispered that it was all right, that he was safe, that she wouldn't let anything hurt him. But her voice shook, because we all knew it wasn't all right. Would never be all right again. Too many years had passed, too much damage had been done, too many lies had been built into truths, and too many truths had been buried under lies. Malachi took another step forward. Margaret flinched back, pushing the boy further behind her. The vampire lord noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, and something in his expression shifted. The rage that had been building behind his eyes receded slightly, replaced by something more calculating, more controlled, more dangerous in its precision. He asked Margaret if she knew who he was. She nodded, unable to speak, trembling so hard I could see it from where I stood. He asked if she knew what he could do to her, what he should do to her for stealing his child, for letting him believe Lysander was dead, for 7 years of torture that had nearly destroyed him. She nodded again, still silent, waiting for death that we all knew was coming. But Malachi surprised us both. He looked at Lysander, at the boy who barely remembered him, at the son he'd lost and somehow found again, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle, careful, the tone you'd use approaching a wounded animal that might bolt if you moved too quickly. He asked Lysander if he remembered him. If he remembered Shadowmere Castle. If he remembered a wooden raven and a father who'd loved him more than anything in this world or any other. The boy's tears spilled over, ran down his cheeks in silent rivers. He nodded, so slightly I almost missed it. But Malachi saw, and his own eyes, those blood-red eyes that had seen centuries of death and darkness, began to glisten with moisture that might have been tears if vampires could cry. Lysander whispered something, so quietly even I couldn't hear it from 10 feet away. But Malachi heard. His supernatural senses caught every syllable, every breath, every heartbeat, and whatever the boy said made the vampire lord close his eyes as if he'd been struck. When Malachi opened his eyes again, he looked at Margaret with an expression I couldn't read. Then he did something I never expected. He thanked her for keeping his son alive, for protecting him when Malachi couldn't, for giving Lysander 7 years of life even if those years had been stolen, even if they'd been built on lies, even if they'd cost both of them everything, because she'd done what Malachi hadn't been able to do. She'd saved Lysander from whatever conspiracy had tried to kill him, from forces that would have succeeded if she'd left the child in that burning castle. She'd chosen him over her own safety, her own freedom, her own future. She'd loved his son enough to sacrifice everything, and whatever else she'd done, whatever lies she'd told, whatever pain she'd caused, that love had kept Lysander alive, had given Malachi a chance he'd thought was lost forever, had made this impossible moment possible. Margaret collapsed, simply dropped to her knees in the dirt and sobbed, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. 7 years of guilt and fear and desperate love pouring out of her in a flood that couldn't be stopped. 7 years of carrying a secret that had weighed on her like stones. 7 years of knowing she'd done something unforgivable even if she'd done it for the right reasons. Lysander moved then, pulled away from Margaret's protective grip, and stepped toward his father. Each step was hesitant, uncertain. The movement of a child approaching something he wanted desperately, but was terrified to reach for. Something that might disappear if he moved too quickly. Something that might hurt him if he got too close. Malachi knelt, dropped to his knees in the dirt so he was eye level with his son, made himself smaller, less threatening. Just a father waiting for his child to decide if he still remembered what love looked like. They stood like that for a small eternity. Father and son, separated by 7 years and 3 feet of space that might as well have been an ocean, neither moving, neither speaking, just looking at each other with expressions that held too much pain to voice. Then Lysander broke, ran the last few steps and threw himself into his father's arms with the kind of desperate abandon that only children can manage, buried his face in Malachi's chest and cried for the father he'd thought was gone, cried for the childhood that had been stolen, cried for 7 years of confusion and fear, and not understanding why the world had turned so dark and strange. Malachi wrapped his arms around his son with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a being so powerful and ancient, held him like he was made of glass, like he might shatter at any moment, like this was a dream that would dissolve if he gripped too tightly, and he made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a sob, not quite a scream, something between grief and joy that came from so deep in his chest it seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. They stayed like that for a long time, father and son, reunited. While Margaret wept in the dirt and I stood frozen, watching something I had no right to witness, watching a moment so private and profound and painful that it felt like I was intruding on something sacred. Eventually, Malachi looked up, not at Margaret, at me. His eyes found mine across the clearing and held them with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I forced myself to meet his gaze, to accept whatever judgment he was about to render, to take responsibility for everything I'd done and everything I'd failed to do. He told me that I'd kept my promise, that I'd led him to the truth I'd sworn to find, that I'd helped reunite him with his son when everyone else in the kingdom had failed, that I'd been brave when bravery seemed impossible and honest when lies would have been easier. He told me that he owed me a debt, a life debt, The kind that vampires took seriously, the kind that could never be fully repaid, but would be honored until one of us died. He told me that if I ever needed anything at all, I need only call his name and he would answer. That I would have his protection, his resources, his power, whatever I required. I didn't want any of it. Didn't want rewards or protection or debts. I'd done what I'd done because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Because a child's frightened eyes had haunted me for 7 years. Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about what you gain. It's about what you can finally put down. But I knew refusing would insult him, would diminish what he was offering, would turn something meaningful into something cheap. So I bowed my head and accepted, thanked him for his kindness, for sparing my life when he could have ended it, for trusting me when trust seemed impossible. Then I turned to leave, to walk back through the cursed woods alone, to return to my simple life and try to pretend this night had never happened, to go back to cleaning floors and washing linens and being invisible. But Malachi stopped me with a single word, asked me where I thought I was going, reminded me that this wasn't finished, that Lord Ravencroft still lived, that the conspiracy that had tried to kill Lysander still existed, that bringing the child home meant nothing if the people who'd stolen him away remained free to try again. He asked me if I remembered what I'd seen 7 years ago, if I could identify the other men with Ravencroft, if I would stand as witness against the king's closest advisor and risk everything to see justice done. I should have said no, should have explained that I'd done enough, that I'd kept my promise and earned whatever absolution I was going to get, that I was just a peasant who wanted to return to obscurity and safety. But I looked at Lysander, at the boy clinging to his father, at the child who'd spent 7 years stolen from his life because powerful men had decided he was a useful pawn in their political games, and I thought about all the other powerless people I'd known, all the servants and peasants and forgotten souls who'd been used and discarded by people who viewed them as furniture, as tools, as things rather than people. I thought about my parents in their unmarked graves, about Margaret sobbing in the dirt, about 7 years of a father's grief and a child's fear, about all the injustice in the world that went unpunished because the people it hurt didn't matter enough to fight for. And I told Malachi, yes, I would stand as witness. I would testify against Lord Ravencroft. I would tell the truth no matter what it cost me, because someone had to. Because if not me, then who? Because the dead speak in silence. And maybe, finally, it was time for the living to speak loud enough to answer them. Malachi smiled. It was a terrible smile. The smile of a predator who'd just been given permission to hunt. The smile of a father who'd waited 7 years for vengeance and was finally about to collect. The smile of an ancient vampire lord who'd been wounded and was now ready to remind the world exactly why wounding him was a mistake. He told me to return to Thornwick, to continue my normal life as if nothing had changed, to wait for his signal. When the time came, when everything was prepared, he would send for me, and then, together, we would ensure that Lord Cassius Ravencroft and everyone who'd helped him would learn what it meant to cross House Shadowmere. The reckoning was coming. Justice, all, so long delayed, would finally be served. And I, Elara, just Elara, the woman who cleaned floors and whose existence had been summarized in 3 words, would stand before the entire kingdom and tell the truth. I left the hidden village as dawn began to break, walked back through the cursed woods with the morning light filtering through the branches. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening, less magical. Just trees and shadows and the ordinary dangers of wildlife and uneven ground. But I knew the truth now, knew that beneath the ordinary surface lurked ancient power, knew that magic still existed in places where civilization hadn't tamed it, knew that impossible things happened every day to people who were brave enough or foolish enough to go looking for them. 3 weeks later, Lord Malachi Shadowmere returned to the king's court. He brought with him his son, very much alive, and a peasant girl with calloused hands who'd witnessed a crime 7 years ago and was finally brave enough to speak. The trial lasted 2 days. I stood before nobles and royalty and told my story. Told them what I'd seen the night of the fire, identified Lord Ravencroft and his conspirators, answered their questions with a steady voice even when my hands shook, even when they tried to discredit me, even when they called me liar and manipulator and opportunist. But I had the truth on my side, and I had Malachi Shadowmere standing behind me, silent and terrible, daring anyone to call his witness false. And I had Lysander, alive and real and proof that everything I said was true. In the end, justice was served. Lord Ravencroft and his allies were found guilty, stripped of their titles and lands, executed for their crimes against House Shadowmere and the kingdom itself. Wasn't enough. Could never be enough to balance 7 years of stolen life. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong, that even the powerful could be held accountable. And me? I never went back to cleaning floors. Malachi honored his debt by offering me a position in his household, not as a servant, as something else, an advisor, a friend, someone who'd proven she could be trusted with the things that mattered most. I accepted, because I'd spent my whole life being invisible, being overlooked, being summarized in 3 words. And I was tired of it, tired of being small, tired of accepting my place, tired of letting the world tell me what I was worth. The dead don't speak. But that night in the graveyard, they screamed loud enough for me to hear, screamed about injustice and silence and all the wrongs that go unpunished when good people stay quiet. And I'd listened. I'd acted. I'd changed everything. My name is Alara, just Alara. No family name worth remembering, no lineage worth speaking of. But I stood before the most powerful people in the kingdom and told the truth when lying would have been easier. I helped reunite a father and son when everyone else had failed. I kept a promise to the dead and gave justice to the living. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. Maybe I don't need to be anyone other than who I am. A woman with calloused hands and a spine of steel. A woman who learned that power doesn't always come from titles or bloodlines or ancient magic. Sometimes power comes from simply refusing to stay silent, from choosing courage when fear seems easier, from loving justice enough to risk everything for it. The ravens still circle Shadowmere Castle, black wings against gray skies, watching, waiting, speaking in the language of the dead and the living alike. And sometimes, when I stand in the courtyard and watch them fly, I think about a wooden raven named Corvus, about a child who loved it, about a father who carved it with his own hands, about all the small, precious things that connect us to each other across silence and time and impossible distances. The dead speak in silence, but the living, if we're brave enough, can answer in voices loud enough to shake the very foundations of the world. And sometimes that's all it takes. One voice, one truth, one person refusing to let injustice win. Just Alara, who cleaned floors, who found her voice, who changed everything.